The greatest success and most important public health achievements in human history is undoubtedly the eradication of the disease smallpox from the earth. Smallpox sucked, so eradicating smallpox was big, huge for all mankind. But what does that have to do with Africans or African Americans? Well, the reason why you don't know is why this is a broken record. Today we're going to look at the independent development of immunization in different parts of the world. But we're going to focus on how the practice that originated in Africa became the basis of modern global immunization today.
Bumper! Mr. Frank, Mr. Frank. Oh, I. 1, 2, 3. I wanna put you emotion. 1, 2, 3.
The story of immunization begins with smallpox, the bane of mankind for thousands of years. The earliest form of the immunization practice that was adopted across the world was first recorded in North America way back in the year 1706. Smallpox had been introduced to the West African region in the 15th century by European explorers, the same way it would be introduced to the North and South American continents and the Australian subcontinent. Even though smallpox devastated the West African region, it didn't kill off the African population, but no one ever seems to ask why. The earliest immunized people in Western history were African American slaves, immunized in Africa and brought to the American continents before the US independence. This was first reported by a famous preacher from Boston called Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was famous for his zeal in bringing witches to puritanical justice. If you've ever heard of the Salem witch trials or seen the movies, he's the main guy. He persecuted witches passionately, but his encounter with African science would change the life of this strange and complicated man.
Somebody call the crazy man.
Cotton Mather had a slave from West Africa called Onesimus, and Onesimus told Cotton Mather about the African remedy to stop the spread of smallpox back home. Africans believed that if smallpox material was put into a cut in the skin, the resulting skin infection would be easily beaten by a healthy person, who would then be immune to smallpox forever. This practice would soon be called inoculation, or immunization. But it wasn't just Onesimus' account. In the early city of Boylston, there were, by multiple accounts, an army of immunized African slaves. In that one city alone, the large immunized African American community in Boylston was actually the first clue about immunization in Western science. So Cotton Mather switched his passion from witches to immunization. And I'm sure many witches were glad. But Cotton Mather was a big fanboy of an organization back in London called the Royal Society. Kind of like the Illuminati before they got doxxed. And the Royal Society's function was to steal inventions and pass them off as British. The original name of the Royal Society was the Invisible College. You can't call it a conspiracy theory if you call yourself the Invisible College.
1, 2, 3. I wanna put you emotion. 1, 2, 3. I wanna put you emotion.
Then, almost a decade after Cotton Mather recorded his conversation with Onesimus, the Invisible College publishes 2 accounts of immunization coming from the Ottoman Empire, with no mention of the African contribution in any way. These reports were written by 2 established fellows of the Royal Society called Timonius and Pilerinus, and Cotton Mather was further inspired in his passion by these reports. But Cotton Mather was never shy of an argument or one to give up any glory. So he did call out the Royal Society, reminding them that he learned about this from Africans well before any Europeans had any clue about it. Cotton Mather was not the only one testifying to immunized Africans. Other prominent Bostonians like William Cooper and Benjamin Coleman also wrote down testimonies of conversations they had with immunized Africans and the multitude of immunized Africans in the Boston region.
Listen this one, you must understand, cause it's Yago man. Mr. Frank, Mr. Frank. Oh, I. 1, 2, 3. I wanna put you emotion. 1, 2, 3. I wanna put you emotion.
Cotton and a young doctor, Zebediah Boylston, launched the first immunization movement in Boston, which immediately launches the first anti-immunization movement in history. But these ancestral anti-vaxxers knew that immunization came from Africa, and boy, they were not having it. One of them actually threw a grenade into Cotton Mather's window. But he was an old school preacher man. He used it to light up his pipe and a witch before he threw it back outside. You see, Cotton was as stubborn as a fireproof witch, and he embraced the African immunization practice with the same passion he used to hunt witches. Back then, the resistance to immunization was religious. And that's why it's crazy that the champion will be a Puritan witch-burning minister like Cotton Mather.
Listen this one, you must understand, because it's Yago man.
After the next smallpox outbreak in Boston, it became clear that African immunization was effective. So to his delight, the Royal Society invited Cotton Mather and the doctor, Zebediah Boylston, to London to join the Royal Society with honours, and actually paid the doctor Zebediah in gold for his write-up of the immunization practice during the Boston epidemic. Before you ask, no. Onesimus' black ass was not invited to London to join the Royal Society, and neither were the African slaves in the Boston region who assisted Zebediah, nor the African traditional healers who invented and developed the practice in the first place to save their own brothers and sisters from a new disease that threatened the African population. Now some may ask, why so certain the Royal Society learned about immunization from Zebediah and the Africans in Boston, and not from the reports from Constantinople? Well, there's a number of reasons, but the most obvious is Zebediah is the one who got paid in gold by Britain for his written write-up during the Boston outbreak, and Zebediah's written write-up was the basis of the immunization procedure that was adopted across Britain. In Boston, Zebediah was assisted and surrounded by African slaves with first-hand knowledge of the procedure. In London, Zebediah presented his work to a distinguished body of Royal Society fellows and the Princess of Wales. He was paid 1,000 golden guineas for his write-up, and he returned from England an extremely wealthy man. Immunization did not take off in Britain until after Boylston's presentation and publication, and all the subsequent methods of immunization were based on his detailed write-up that he made while he was surrounded by an army of Africans with first-hand knowledge of the procedure. This is a pretty clear case of follow the money. When the Royal Society published Boylston's account, the African contribution was left out of it. This is also the key point at which the African contribution is left out moving forward.
1, 2, 3, I wanna put you emotion. 1, 2, 3, I wanna put you.
African inoculation, without the African, continued to spread rapidly across North America and Britain, and then slowly across Europe. British doctors began to make a lot of money off African immunization, and one of the doctors who cashed in was a young fella by name of Edward Jenner. But first, let's look at the spread of immunization in North America. Immunization would rapidly become widespread in America, and over the next few decades, Americans would decide they didn't like tea, leading to the War of Independence from Britain. George Washington would actually immunize all American troops the African way to protect them from British biological warfare. Let that sink in. American troops immunized with an African technique to save the new country from the British. People should know this stuff, and African Americans get no credit, just bad credit. The earliest historical mention of any sort of immunization comes from China, recorded in medical journals of the Han Dynasty. This practice involved blowing or snorting finely crushed smallpox powder into the nose. This would possibly be a more popular form of immunization today. College kids might love it, but it is a bit different from the practice that was developed in Africa. But it is the first record of attempting to control the smell of smallpox through a form of immunization, and also perhaps the first vaccine party, using the term loosely. This is not about Africans being the first people to invent immunization. To put that in context, China had smallpox immunization records before West Africa had smallpox. There were also ancient practices in some parts of India, and the accounts from the Ottoman Empire describe the women slaves practicing inoculation, not the noble doctors. But it was the West African path of knowledge that led to the global immunization programs today. African development of immunization during the slavery era is impressive, but what's more impressive is the spread of that knowledge across the entire African continent. Every region in Africa adopted immunization culturally as a practice. At the peak of the slave trade, Western Europeans had very little knowledge about the interior of Africa. As smallpox ravaged West African populations and communities, spreading into the interior of Africa via the Atlantic and Arabic slave trades, African healers developed their immunization techniques, and clearly these tribes shared knowledge with each other across the continent. Gods like Shakpata and Shokpono were created to help understand this new disease, and Onesimus probably wisely left that part out when he introduced immunization to Cotton Mather. Then in the late 1790s, almost 100 years after all this started with a slave Onesimus having a candid conversation about public health care in Africa, a young, suave English doctor named Edward Jenner would make a discovery that changed everything. Or did it?
1, 2, 3, I wanna put you in motion, emotion. 1, 2, 3, I wanna put you in motion, emotion. Summer just come to do all the things that we know, all the things that we know, that we know. Summer just come to chant all the things that we know, all the things that we know, that we know. So 1, 2, 3, I wanna put you in motion, emotion. 1, 2, 3, I wanna put you in motion, emotion. Hear me dance, hear me on the way. Somebody call the eye crazy man. Hear me dance, hear me on the way. And somebody call the eye foolish man. Nobody can.
So you might wonder, what happened between Cotton Mather and Onesimus after they saved the world? Well, we don't know Onesimus' real name. Onesimus was the name Cotton Mather gave him, which means useful one, and it sort of proved to be prophetic. But in later years, Cotton Mather would let Onesimus buy his freedom. Cotton Mather was disappointed he was unable to convert Onesimus to Christianity. Onesimus preferred to hold on to his native faith instead of adopt Christianity, probably because of all the witch burning. And this actually had a big impact on Cotton Mather and made him feel like he was a bit of a failure as an evangelist. There's a lot in here for a pretty interesting Hollywood movie, but they'd probably fucking green book it, so I should be very careful what I ask for. But the world should be thankful that one day Onesimus told Cotton Mather, here's a solution to the disease that's been bothering your people for 1,000 years. Oh, and here's your fucking cotton. Cotton.
In a stuffy.